Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Writing Today. In this episode we're going to go through the editing process one more time. I've condensed the editing process down to these 5 simple steps to make it a bit easier for those who are struggling to get through their editing. And I can understand that. Editing in itself can be a slog because you have to go through your book several times. And even then it sometimes feels like there's always mistakes to correct. And that's something that we're going to touch upon in this video. So if you do enjoy this kind of content, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you're interested in more advanced learning when it comes to writing a novel, there's a link to my course workshop in the description below. I'm offering a free course, so if you want to check out my teaching style first, it is there and available. But once you do subscribe to the workshop, you'll have access to all my courses, past, present and future. So it's a great deal and it's a lifetime offer, so be sure to check it out. With that, let's get straight into the very first step in your editing process. The very first tip, and I believe it's a bit of an obvious one for those out there who are experienced with working with longer novels, and that's to take a break. Writing a novel is not easy. It takes months, sometimes even years for some people to complete their novels, and it's understandable. You're constructing a world space with interesting characters, with an interesting story, and that is taxing, both on the mind and body. So with that in mind, after this marathon of completing your first draft, it's time to take a step back and have a break. Now this break can be as long as you want it to. You can take a break for a day, a week, or even a month. During this break, you will come to enjoy other things in life and feel satisfaction for having completed a major step in your passion project. But also it will help you distance yourself from your story. One of the tips that I can give you straight away is not to take a break for just a day. Take a break for a week, maybe 2 weeks I should say at minimum. Because that's plenty of time to get along with other projects and do other things in life, and also let the ending of the story which you've recently completed fade a bit in your mind. You want to be able to stop thinking about your story just for that moment. And the next tip is to enjoy other passion projects and other creative sources, be it another novel, perhaps watch a movie, several movies, a series even. Just distract yourself with other stories to help you distance yourself from your own. Once you have done that, you're ready to tackle step 2. Step 2 is analyzing the bigger picture and beginning your structural editing. Now this can be the most difficult step to get into because once you start editing, all you want to do is correct every little mistake that you've made throughout your novel. And this can take a lot of time because what you're doing is diving into a part of editing that is kind of like donkey work. It's a slog, it's difficult to get through, it's tedious. But when you look at the bigger picture, it's a bit more different because you're reading through your novel again. You're starting at the beginning, going through the chapters and spotting flaws in your structure. That's why it's called structural editing. You're evaluating your story by checking its flow, its plot coherence, and its pacing. And trust me, these are the bigger mistakes that your readers will notice more than your errors in your grammar or your spelling. These are the mistakes that really break a story, and if you leave too many of them in there, even one of them that is detrimental to the plot, it can really bring down the story and it'll be very difficult to get it published. The big picture step really just involves you reading through your novel and taking the time to absorb what works and what doesn't. Note areas in your novel that seem to clash. For example, I mentioned pacing earlier. Sometimes we lean into a certain pacing when we're in a certain mood. And since writing the first draft can take a long time, that means that there's going to be plenty of ups and downs in our lives to affect our story. And that can affect it in a harsh way too. So taking the time to read your novel before you get into the minutiae of editing, you'll better understand the pacing flaws that you have in your story. It's all about creating that flow, and if the flow is breaking up so often, doesn't matter how many grammar and spelling errors you fix, the story isn't going to work. And seeing as these are the bigger issues, you can take your time because this means that you're going to be rewriting some sections. So you're going to have to adjust points in your story and rewrite entire sections. And yes, I know that can be incredibly annoying. After writing an entire novel, the last thing you want to do is redo entire sections. But this is something I personally advise, because you'll find that entire sections can be flawed, and the best thing to do is actually rewrite them than it is to correct the sentence flow and try and get things to work together. it just doesn't work. It's like trying to bend two pipes together, and at the same time you're going to still have gaps and leaks. So get comfortable with doing this before you tackle the smaller errors. The next step is the line editing. It's the content and style of your story. Now, it focuses on sentences, structure, and clarity and style. This is getting a bit smaller now. We're not looking at our story by sections and different scenes and chapters. We are looking at each line and seeing how they flow into the next. Now, the best thing you can do is just check for redundancies. Are you talking about the same thing over and over again? Something you'll only again notice when you're reading through your story than when you're just writing it. This will help you improve your readability. It enhances the story in some aspects. But mainly this is all about avoiding simple mistakes that, like repetition, can bring down your story. You're going to be rephrasing some sentences just to make sure that you carry forward the right emotional impact for some scenes, or make sure you convey the right information in the right manner. You're basically looking at connotations and denotations when it comes to your writing. This is the style that you're going for. So if you feel a sentence feels a little too off for the emotional balance of your scene, for example, it's too cold for a warm scene or too warm for a cold scene, and it detracts from the feelings that you want the reader to feel, these sentences will often need to be rewritten. You'll notice that with each step that I'm talking about, that we're getting a bit more finer in our corrections when it comes to our editing. Because we went from looking at the bigger picture, which is entire scenes, paragraphs, or even chapters, to now looking at sentences line by line, and making sure they flow into each other just right. So of course that brings us to step 4, which is our grammar and spelling checks. This is copy editing at its finest. You're going to be going through your book, looking for grammar mistakes, your punctuation, your spelling errors, and you're going to be correcting them. You'll see plenty of red lines under your sentences, and that's okay. If you're like me, you like to push forward when writing your first rough draft, so you'll ignore those red lines as much as possible to make sure you progress in your writing. So with that in mind, it's now time to tackle those red lines. Look for ways to improve your grammar, to make sure that your sentences are clear. They don't have to be concise, they just need to be clear. And then of course, tackling your spelling mistakes. So with that in mind, if you're using a writing program that has its built-in spelling and grammar checker, I also recommend taking your writing and putting it somewhere else and having another spelling and grammar checker check it out. For example, I'll actually use Google Docs, which has its own built-in checking service, but of course I also use Grammarly as well. This gives me like double barrels, so I can tackle the story and go through everything. But again, this is something that I do. You might be using a different program to write your story that has its own built-in checking service, but I highly recommend you have two. Yes, sometimes our eyes deceive us and we go over sentences reading what we want to read, but really there's a lot of mistakes there. But having at least two of these things, checking everything out to make sure it's just right, will help you avoid those mistakes and hopefully create a very clean product. And now we're on step 5, which is just the final polish, your proofreading. Now this is just the final step where you're going to be reading through your novel and making sure it all hits the right points by going through and eliminating any remaining errors. Now there are many proofreading techniques out there. I've heard some writers like to read their story backwards because that way they tackle their story in a different direction, they'll be able to spot different errors. I can't vouch for that, but it is an interesting technique. Another technique which I do use and I also recommend is reading it out loud. But if you've tackled each step before this one slowly and methodically, you'll have covered most bases, and there'll most likely be 1 or 2 errors in the book in itself, and that's a comforting fact, because you want to reach the end of this process and finally have a finished story, which you can show others, publish, and also just be satisfied knowing that you've created a polished product. This is the last read through just to make sure everything is right. So take your time reading your story and try to have some fun. This is one of the reasons that I highly recommend reading out loud, because I believe most writers out there are writing stories that they want to read. So you've created a story that hopefully you enjoy. Be sure to read it out loud and capture those moments the way you want to capture them. And I'm sure it'll be a fantastic experience. And there you have it, the 5-step process that I highly recommend you take when you start editing your novel. I've recently gone through this process when editing one of my novels, and it's now in its own final stages. but these are the steps that I tend to follow because they seem to cover all the bases. It's all about making sure the format is right and the corrections of all these small errors, but these are just the steps that I follow when editing a novel. I'm pretty sure those experienced out there have their own steps that they like to follow. If there are any steps that you like to follow when you are editing your novel and want beginners to also try out, be sure to let us know in the comments below. And that brings us to the end of this episode. I do hope you enjoyed, and if you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you in the next episode of Writing Today. Bye for now.